1942. The night sky was alive with thunder. Searchlights clawed through the clouds. Anti-aircraft fire tore open the darkness. And deep within a hangar on the outskirts of Hertfordshire, a man everyone had already forgotten was about to break the rules of war and physics. His name was not written in history books. He wasn't a commander, nor a scientist from some elite university. He was a mechanic, a quiet, oil-stained engineer named Ted West, working on the de Havilland Mosquito bomber, a plane already called a miracle made of wood. But for Ted, it wasn't enough. He had seen too many pilots fail to return, too many of his friends vanish into smoke and silence over the channel. And on that freezing night, as German fighters tore British bombers apart, Ted decided to risk everything, his career, his freedom, maybe even his life, for one impossible idea, an illegal trick that could make the Mosquito outrun every German plane in the sky. Ted West wasn't supposed to be there. The Mosquito project was already one of Britain's most secret engineering miracles, a bomber built not from metal, but from wood. Lightweight, fast, and beautiful, it was designed to slip through radar and speed past danger. But speed was never enough. The Luftwaffe's Focke-Wulf 19s were faster now, deadlier, and their bullets shredded even the Mosquito's graceful frame. Every mission ended with fewer men returning, and for Ted, every empty bunk in the barracks was a wound that wouldn't close. He was a mechanic, not a pilot, but he saw what the engineers at the de Havilland factory refused to, that the engines, those Rolls-Royce Merlins, were being held back by regulations. The Air Ministry had set strict limits on boost pressure and RPMs to prevent damage. On paper, it was safety. In the air, it was suicide. Ted had worked on those engines long enough to know they could take more, much more, if you were willing to ignore the rulebook. But in wartime Britain, ignoring the rulebook was a fast way to end up in a military prison. Yet one night, as he stood beside the stripped-down fuselage of a Mosquito returning from a mission, holes stitched across its belly, engine blackened with oil, Ted made his choice. "If we don't start fighting like we're already losing," he muttered, "we'll lose everything." He stayed after hours, when the hangar lights dimmed and the wind howled through the pumps in the corrugated walls. Under the silver gleam of his wrench, he began to work. What he was about to do could be called sabotage, or genius. He adjusted the carburetors, recalibrated the boost control, and found a way to override the government-imposed limiter. His goal? Force more air, more fuel, more power into the Merlin's heart. It was dangerous. One miscalculation could cause detonation, a fireball, the loss of the aircraft. But to Ted, the real danger was doing nothing. When the test pilot arrived the next morning, Ted's hands were shaking. He didn't tell anyone what he'd done. He just stood in the corner, silent, as the Mosquito roared to life. The sound was different, sharper, angrier. The engine didn't hum anymore, it snarled. The plane screamed down the runway and lifted into the dawn, climbing faster than anyone had seen. Ted watched it vanish into the mist and whispered to himself, "Come on, girl. Show them what you can do." Minutes later, the radio crackled. "Ground, this is Bravo 2-1. You won't believe this. She's flying past red line. Feels like she wants to break free of the sky itself." The words sent chills down Ted's spine. He'd done it. His illegal adjustment had turned the Mosquito into something no one expected. Faster than the fastest German fighter. Capable of outrunning death itself. But victory came with fear. He knew the Air Ministry would never approve. If they found out, they'd court-martial him, strip his credentials. Maybe worse. So he kept his secret buried under silence, letting pilots think it was luck or wind or divine intervention. Yet as more missions came back alive, men who should have died returning with smiles and tears, rumors began to spread. Someone somewhere had tuned the Mosquito to defy gravity, and in the smoky pubs near Hatfield, whispers began. "There's a mad mechanic out there who's making planes fly faster than God intended." Ted never confirmed it. He just kept working, tightening bolts, listening to engines sing like they'd been given souls. Deep down, he knew what he'd done wasn't just mechanical. It was human. It was the act of a man refusing to let fear dictate survival. And soon that defiance would catch the attention of men far above his rank. and put him at the center of a secret that could decide the fate of Britain's skies. The secret spread like smoke, invisible, unstoppable, and impossible to contain. Within weeks, the test reports from Hatfield reached the Air Ministry. Several Mosquito bombers were clocked at speeds beyond any recorded limits. Pilots returning from missions swore their aircraft had come alive, outrunning German interceptors that once tore them apart with ease. Yet no one could explain why. On paper, the planes were identical to every other model rolling out of the factory, but in the air they behaved like something entirely different, wilder, hungrier, almost alive with purpose. The ministry suspected tampering. De Havilland's senior engineers were summoned, their blueprints examined, their assembly lines inspected. Nothing was found, and through it all, Ted West kept his head down, hands black with grease, pretending to be just another nameless mechanic in the back of the hangar. But inside, his heart raced with equal parts pride and fear. He had created something powerful, too powerful. One night, the factory sirens wailed. German bombers had been spotted crossing the channel, heading straight for Hertfordshire. Workers scrambled for cover as explosions painted the horizon red. Ted refused to leave the hangar. If they hit the fuel lines, he shouted over the roaring sky, "This whole place will go up." But he wasn't there to save equipment. He was there to protect his secret. Amid the shaking walls and falling dust, he hid the modified carburetors, the notes, the carefully scratched calculations that could expose what he'd done. As bombs fell and the lights flickered, Ted crouched beneath the wings of a Mosquito, his creation, his risk, and made a silent promise. If this place burned, the knowledge would burn with him. The raid passed, leaving the air thick with smoke and silence. When dawn came, the factory stood scarred, but standing. Ted's secret had survived another night. The next morning, officials arrived, stiff uniforms, cold eyes, questions that cut like knives. "Mr. West," one of them said, "you've been working unusual shifts, haven't you?" Ted tried to keep his voice steady. "We're short on men, sir. Someone's got to keep the planes ready," but the man's gaze didn't waver. "The ministry believes there's been unauthorized modification to aircraft engines. Sabotage, even. If that's true, we'll find out." Ted's stomach twisted. He could feel the walls closing in. To confess meant punishment. To lie meant danger. He said nothing, just silence, the kind that hangs heavy in the air before thunder. Meanwhile, in the skies over occupied France, something extraordinary was happening. Mosquito crews began reporting impossible victories. They flew through storms of flak, diving through fire and metal, and still came home. One pilot described it best. "It felt like the engines were pulling us toward life, like they wanted to survive." The Germans, Tabarms, baffled and furious, dubbed the Mosquito the wooden ghost, a plane they could see but never catch. Propaganda officers dismissed it as Allied exaggeration, but Luftwaffe pilots knew the truth. They watched helplessly as the wooden bombers slipped past them untouchable, vanishing into the clouds. Inside de Havilland's war rooms, engineers began tearing apart every recovered aircraft, desperate to understand what had changed. They checked the wings, the fuselage, the weight ratios, everything. But the secret was in the heart, buried deep in the Merlin engine's veins. And only one man knew exactly where to look. Ted would walk past those investigations every day, pretending to be disinterested. But each time he heard them mention engine irregularities, his pulse quickened. He knew it was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots. And when that happened, he'd be finished. Then came the mission that changed everything. December 1942. A Mosquito squadron was ordered to strike a Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, a mission so dangerous it bordered on suicide. Intelligence officers expected catastrophic losses. "Half won't make it home," one colonel said grimly. Ted overheard those words as he worked beneath the wing of one of the departing planes. He felt something inside him twist. That old fury, the one that hated losing men to bureaucratic fear. He made his decision. That night he stayed late again. The hangar was cold, his breath white in the dark. He worked silently, methodically, tweaking the engines of 3 Mosquitoes assigned to the mission. He boosted their intake pressure by a fraction, enough to make them fly faster, higher, longer. And when dawn came, those bombers lifted into the air with an invisible edge no one could see. Hours later, radio reports came in. Target destroyed Otkaged. All aircraft returning. The room erupted in disbelief. Missions like that never came back intact. Yet here they were, streaking home at speeds radar operators couldn't believe. When the pilots landed, one of them climbed down, eyes wide. "I don't know what you did to her," he told the ground crew, "but she flew like she was alive." Ted turned away, his heart thundering. He'd just changed the course of the war, and no one even knew his name. But victory always draws attention. A week later, he was summoned to an office lined with polished oak and cigarette smoke. Behind the desk sat Jeffrey de Havilland himself, the man whose name the entire project bore. "You've been busy, Mr. West," he said, his voice low but not unkind. "We've traced several irregularities back to your maintenance logs. Care to explain?" Ted hesitated, then spoke with quiet conviction. "Sir, those engines can handle more than the ministry thinks. I couldn't stand by while our men died because of a number on a chart." Silence filled the room. De Havilland studied him, this grease-stained mechanic with trembling hands but eyes full of fire. Then finally he smiled faintly. "You realize what you've done is technically illegal?" "Yes, sir," Ted said. "But it works." De Havilland leaned back, thoughtful. "Sometimes," he murmured, "rules are written by men who've never heard the sound of an engine in flight." He ordered Ted's modifications to be documented, refined, and tested under official supervision. What began as an act of rebellion became part of the Mosquito's legacy, a sanctioned upgrade that pushed its limits even further. Soon, British bombers were flying faster than ever, striking deep into Germany, saving countless lives. And though Ted's name never appeared on any report, every pilot who felt that surge of impossible speed owed it to the man who refused to obey fear. Still, Ted never saw himself as a hero. To him, it wasn't about glory. It was about the men whose lives depended on the machine. Every engine he touched carried the weight of those faces, the laughter in the mess hall, the empty chairs that haunted him after every mission. His illegal trick had started as defiance but became something far greater, a symbol of what happens when courage refuses to ask permission. In the months that followed, the Mosquito became a legend. It outran fighters, bombed railways, and shattered targets deep within enemy territory. The Germans called it the Wooden Wonder. Pilots called it salvation. And deep in a quiet corner of Hatfield, Ted West listened to their stories with quiet pride, never revealing the truth. Because he knew, history isn't always written by generals or kings. Sometimes it's written by the hands of those who fix the engines, who break the rules, who dare to believe that even in war, one act of courage can change the sky forever. What is 1943? The war had turned into a storm that never ended. Every night, the skies over Europe burned, tracer fire like streaks of lightning, cities swallowed in flame. The Mosquito squadrons had become the thin, defiant line between survival and despair. And at the heart of their legend was Ted West's forbidden gift, an engine that shouldn't have existed, a heartbeat tuned beyond the edge of reason. But every miracle comes with a cost. As the months passed, Ted began noticing small signs. Engines returning with scorched cylinders, worn bearings, the faint metallic scream of machines pushed too far. His modifications had saved lives, but they had also unleashed a dangerous truth. To go faster than the enemy, you had to dance with destruction. And in that dance, one misstep could mean death. The warnings came quietly at first. A test pilot returned from a mission over the Rhine and reported an engine failure mid-flight. The aircraft barely made it back, trailing smoke like blood from a wound. Ted examined the wreckage in silence, his eyes tracing the fractures along the crankcase, the melted spark plugs, the cracked pistons. He knew what it meant. His boosted engines were operating beyond safety. "They're running too hot," one of his colleagues said softly. "You've made them stronger, but you've made them fragile." Ted didn't answer. He just stared at the shattered remains, feeling the guilt settle like ash in his chest. How many more could break before his secret cost lives instead of saving them? But the war didn't stop for reflection. Orders came in for a new kind of mission, daylight raids deep inside enemy territory. No darkness to hide behind, no margin for error. The Mosquito crews volunteered without hesitation, proud of their reputation as the ghosts of the RAF. Ted watched them prepare, young men with nervous smiles, some barely 20. He tried to tell himself that what he'd done gave them a fighting chance. Yet when the engines roared to life, that familiar fear returned. The fear that one of them might not come home because of him. As the planes lifted into the cold morning sky, the hangar shook under the thunder of twin Merlins. Ted stood there, hands trembling, praying that his gamble would hold. Hours later, the first message came through. Enemy contact. Multiple Focke-Wulfs inbound. The room went silent. Radios hissed and crackled. Then beep. They can't catch us. Repeat, they can't keep up. Ted felt his heart leap. He imagined the scene. The Mosquitoes diving through clouds, German fighters straining to close the distance, engines screaming, pilots gripping the controls as the wooden aircraft surged ahead, light and unstoppable. For a moment, he believed, maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. But seconds later, another voice cut through the static. Bravo 2-1 hit. Engine failure. Going down. The words tore through the room like shrapnel. Ted froze. His mind raced through every modification, every bolt, every ratio. Had his trick finally turned deadly? The next day they brought back what was left of the aircraft. The fuselage was torn apart, one engine completely destroyed. Ted stood over it in silence as the others worked. The smell of burnt oil and metal filled the hangar. One of the officers muttered, "Damn thing overheated." The boost's too high, Ted said nothing, but inside his world cracked. He knew he was responsible, at least partly. His defiance had kept dozens of men alive, but now it had killed one. The thought haunted him through every sleepless night that followed. He began spending his evenings alone in the hangar, long after the others had gone. He would sit beside the engines, listening to the echoes of the war outside, distant bombers droning overhead, the faint rumble of thunder from across the channel. To him, the engines weren't machines anymore. They were living things, hearts that beat for men who risked everything. He ran his hands along the metal, whispering like a confession. You're all they have up there. Don't fail them now. Word of the accident spread quickly. The ministry began questioning the integrity of the modified engines. De Havilland's engineers were under pressure to explain, and Ted's name came up again. This time there would be no quiet conversation. He was summoned to London, not to a workshop, but to a boardroom lined with medals and men who had never touched a wrench in their lives. Mr. West, one official began, your alterations have resulted in mechanical failure leading to loss of aircraft and crew. Do you deny this? Ted took a deep breath. No, sir, but those same changes have saved dozens more. The man leaned forward, his voice sharp. You played God with government property. You gambled with lives. Ted's jaw tightened. No, sir. I gambled for them. The room fell silent. It would have been easy for the ministry to punish him, to make him an example. But war has a way of bending morality. Reports continued to show that the modified Mosquitoes were outperforming every expectation. Even with occasional failures, their success rate was unmatched. Commanders begged for more of them. Pilots wrote letters praising the aircraft's speed, calling it the only thing that kept us alive. The ministry couldn't ignore that, so instead of condemnation, they gave Ted an impossible order. Fix it. Make it safe. Make it last. And for the first time, he was allowed to work in the open. No longer a shadow, but a man trying to perfect his rebellion. For weeks, he pushed himself beyond exhaustion. He studied airflow patterns, fuel mixtures, cooling ratios. His eyes grew bloodshot, his hands blistered, but he wouldn't stop. If it's going to be faster, he told himself, it has to be smarter too. He discovered a way to stabilize the boost without overheating, adjusting the supercharger's bypass valves to manage pressure. When he tested it, the engine roared, steady, powerful, and controlled. For the first time, Ted smiled without guilt. He had turned chaos into balance. Then came the day of reckoning. A new Mosquito, fitted with Ted's revised system, was scheduled for a live mission. Ted watched it take off, the dawn light glinting off its wooden wings. He stood on the runway until the sound faded into silence. Hours later, the radio came alive again. Target hit. No losses. Returning home, relief flooded him. The test had succeeded. When the plane landed, the pilot climbed out, grinning. "She's perfect," he said. "Whatever you did, keep doing it." Ted turned away, hiding the tears that burned his eyes. It was over. His creation had survived the storm. That night, as the hangar fell quiet, Ted stood beneath the stars. The war still raged, but for the first time he felt peace. He'd faced his own reckoning, not just with the ministry, but with himself. His illegal trick had begun as an act of desperation, born from grief and anger. But through fire and failure, it had become something greater. Proof that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear win. As he listened to the hum of distant engines overhead, he whispered into the cold night air, "Fly fast, boys, faster than fear." And somewhere high above the darkness, the ghosts of the Mosquito bombers answered. Wooden wings cutting through the wind, carrying with them the legacy of one mechanic who refused to give up on them, no matter the cost. By 1944, the war had begun to tilt. The Allies were pushing back, reclaiming skies once ruled by German steel. The Mosquito, that wooden ghost of the RAF, was now a legend whispered through the smoke of every airfield. But legends have a cost. And for Ted West, the price of defiance was finally coming due. His name still didn't appear on official documents, yet everyone in Hatfield knew. The man who had dared to break the rules had changed the war. Still, Ted himself carried a different burden. The weight of the men he'd lost along the way, and the haunting question of whether salvation had justified the risk. He walked the hangars like a shadow now, his uniform stained, his eyes older than his years. Every time a Mosquito's engines roared to life, he would close his eyes, not in pride but in prayer. He had built something unstoppable, but he could no longer control where it went, or how many lives it would claim before peace returned. He began to dream of the ones who didn't make it back. They came to him in the dark, faces half-remembered beneath flight goggles, their voices muffled by static. "We made it, Ted," some whispered. Others asked, "Why didn't I?" The war had turned his mind into a battlefield of its own, between the pride of invention and the guilt of its consequence. He still worked, of course. There was no time not to. But his hands shook now, the precision fading under the weight of exhaustion. Engineers admired him, but few truly understood him. They called him a genius. He called himself a mechanic trying to atone. When the ministry offered him a promotion, an official title, better pay, and the chance to lead a research team, he refused. "I don't want a desk," he said quietly. "Engines don't talk from behind papers." One evening, after another long day of testing, Ted was summoned to the base hospital. A pilot named Arthur "Hawk" Hollis, one of the first to fly with Ted's modified engines, had been wounded during a mission. Ted rushed to his bedside, his boots echoing down the cold corridor. Hollis's body was wrapped in bandages, his skin pale but his eyes still burned with life. When he saw Ted, he smiled weakly. "You made her fly, mate," he whispered, "faster than fear." Ted sat beside him, his throat tight. "I made her dangerous too." Hollis shook his head. "No, you made her worth flying." There was a silence between them, the kind that words can't cross. That night, as Ted walked back through the rain, those words followed him like ghosts, worth flying. Maybe that was what all this had been about, giving men something worth believing in when everything else was falling apart. But belief didn't erase the toll. By mid-1944, the strain of his work had begun to erode him. He barely slept, rarely ate, and lived in a constant hum of tension. Every report of a crash or engine failure hit him like a personal wound. The irony was cruel. The very thing that had made him a quiet hero was also destroying him from within. And yet, he couldn't stop. "The war's not done," he would say, wiping grease from his hands. "Not while there's still one man out there flying slower than he could." He started working on an advanced variant of the Merlin engine, experimenting with fuel injection and cooling systems that could push performance even further. It was no longer about rules or orders. It was about redemption, a final attempt to perfect what he had once broken. Then came D-Day. The Mosquitoes flew above the beaches of Normandy, scouting enemy positions, disrupting convoys and striking targets with impossible precision. They were faster than anything in the sky, and their success astonished everyone, even the Germans who had once mocked the idea of a wooden aircraft. Ted watched from England as reports flooded in. The Mosquitoes are unstoppable. He felt pride swell in his chest, but it was hollow, heavy, because he knew that behind every victory, there were still names being written on memorials. He had given them a weapon of speed, but speed didn't make men immortal. It only gave them a fighting chance. And that, Ted realized, was all war ever offered. A few weeks later, Ted collapsed in the hangar. His body had simply had enough. Years of sleepless nights, fumes, and relentless stress caught up with him. The doctors said it was exhaustion, nothing more, nothing less. But those who knew him understood it was the weight of the war that had finally broken him. He woke in a hospital bed, surrounded by the low hum of machines. Through the window, he could see the runway, his runway, where the Mosquitoes still took off into the dawn. For the first time in years, he let himself rest. "Maybe they don't need me anymore," he whispered to the nurse. But deep down, he knew they always would. Not for the man himself, but for what he represented. The idea that one ordinary person, armed with conviction and courage, could defy the machinery of war and make something beautiful out of chaos. When he recovered, Ted was different. Quieter, gentler, older in spirit. He no longer worked through the night, no longer hid from the men he'd once feared losing. Instead, he spoke to them, the young mechanics, the apprentices just starting their journey. He taught them not just how to tune engines, but how to listen to them, to understand that every machine carried a pulse, a story. "Engines are like people," he'd say. "They don't like being pushed too hard, but they'll give you everything if you treat them right." Some thought he was just sentimental, a relic of the old war, but the ones who listened saw something deeper. A man who had seen the line between destruction and salvation and learned to walk it with humility. By the war's end, the Mosquito had become one of the most celebrated aircraft in history, the bomber that outran everything the enemy could throw at it. Ted West's name was never mentioned in the official archives, but among the pilots and ground crews, he was legend. They called him the Whisperer, the man who taught engines to sing. He watched the victory celebrations from a distance, standing outside the hangar where it all began. Planes roared overhead in salute, their shadows flickering across his face. For a moment, he smiled, not for glory, but for the silence that followed. The kind of silence that comes only after you've given everything you had to something greater than yourself. Yet even in peace, the price lingered. Ted would spend the rest of his life haunted by the sounds of war, the hum of engines, the thud of distant bombs, the whispers of names he could never forget. But he never regretted what he'd done. "If I hadn't broken the rules," he once said, "we'd have broken instead." To him, defiance had never been rebellion for its own sake. It was an act of love, born from the desperate need to protect others. That was the real cost of courage, to carry the burden of your choices long after the world has moved on. As the years passed and peace settled over the fields of England, Ted would often visit the old airstrip at dusk. The hangars were empty now, the engines silent, the ghosts at rest. He would run his fingers along the wooden frame of a restored Mosquito, feeling the faint vibration of memory beneath his touch. "You flew faster than fear," he'd whisper, "and we flew with you." The wind would rise through the grass, carrying with it the echo of propellers, the ghostly hum of the machine that changed the sky, and the man who dared to make it fly. Time has a way of swallowing heroes quietly. The war ended, peace returned, and the world moved on, building faster machines, bigger weapons, louder headlines. But somewhere in the quiet heart of England, in a forgotten airfield overgrown with grown and wildflowers, the ghosts of the Mosquito still whispered through the wind. Decades after the smoke cleared, people would look at photographs of the de Havilland Mosquito and see only a machine. Elegant, wooden, beautiful. Few knew that behind its legend stood a man like Ted West, a grease-stained mechanic who had risked everything not for medals or recognition, but for the lives of strangers who flew through Winnow. He never appeared in parades, never gave speeches. His story existed only in the memories of those who'd lived it, the pilots who had once raced death across the sky, and survived because one man refused to obey the limits written on a piece of paper. After the war, Ted tried to live quietly. He took a small workshop job repairing farm vehicles in Hertfordshire, trading the roar of engines for the hum of tractors and the creak of old timber. But even in peace, he couldn't stop listening for the rhythm of flight. Sometimes when a plane passed overhead, he'd look up and trace its movement against the clouds, his eyes narrowing as if he could still hear the language of its engine. He would smile, then return to his work, the ghost of a wrench always in his hand. To the locals, he was just old Ted, the quiet mechanic with a strange precision in everything he did. They never knew that the same hands once tuned engines that shaped the course of history. Years passed and the stories began to fade. Younger generations grew up in a world where war was a story in books, not a scream in the night. Museums displayed the Mosquito as an engineering marvel, the wooden wonder, the ghost bomber. But the labels never told the human truth behind it. They spoke of speed, range, altitude, but not of the man who stayed awake in a freezing hangar, fingers numb and trembling, because he couldn't bear to see another pilot not return. The records credited engineers, designers, and officials, but history, as always, forgot the mechanic. And yet, perhaps Ted never wanted to be remembered by name. For him, the victory had never been personal. It had been something larger. A quiet belief that courage and imagination could turn fear into flight. But legends have a way of finding their way back into the light. One day, decades after the war, a young historian researching the Mosquito stumbled upon a box of forgotten maintenance logs in the archives at Hatfield. They were written in smudged pencil, signed only T. West. The notes were technical, precise, but between the numbers they told a story. Margin comments read like confessions. Boost too low, not safe for the boys. If the ministry won't allow it, I'll prove it works myself. The historian followed the trail, piecing together what official documents never said. And soon he realized the truth, that the Mosquito's legendary speed, the thing that saved countless lives, wasn't born only from boardroom design, but from the courage of one man who refused to obey fear. When the article was finally published, it caused a quiet stir among aviation historians. For the first time, Ted West's name appeared in the story of the Mosquito, not as a myth, but as a man. Pilots' families began writing letters to his surviving relatives, thanking them. One veteran, now frail and gray, wrote simply, "Tell his family he gave us wings to faster than death." It wasn't a headline or a medal, but it was something far greater: remembrance. The kind of remembrance that doesn't fade when monuments crumble or flags grow old. It lived in the hearts of those who understood that history isn't just written in victories, but in the hands that make them possible. Ted didn't live to see his name restored. He passed away quietly in the late 1960s, in his sleep surrounded by the stillness he had earned. At his funeral, there were only a handful of people, a few mechanics, some pilots, and one old friend who had flown the Mosquito on its deadliest missions. They didn't speak much. Instead, as the coffin was lowered, the sound of distant propellers echoed from a nearby air show, a restored Mosquito flying overhead, its twin Merlin engines roaring like thunder over the countryside. The crowd looked up, eyes wet, and someone whispered, "He'd like that." That sound, that deep, beautiful snarl of engines, was Ted West's legacy. It wasn't carved in stone or written in books. It lived in the roar of machines that refused to yield, in every pilot who pushed through fear, in every engineer who dared to ask, what if? His defiance had not been rebellion for its own sake. It had been an act of faith. Faith in the idea that greatness doesn't belong only to those with power or titles, but to those who see a problem and decide quietly to fix it no matter the cost. And as the decades rolled on, the Mosquito's legend continued to grow. Restoration teams brought old airframes back to life, each rivet and curve a testament to human ingenuity. When the engines roared again, spectators described it as haunting, a sound like memory itself. They didn't know it, but what they were hearing wasn't just machinery, it was a heartbeat. It was the echo of every mechanic who stayed up through the night, every pilot who whispered a prayer before takeoff, every soul who believed that speed could mean survival. And at the center of it all, unseen but eternal, was Ted West, the man who broke the rules so others could live to see another dawn. Because that's what courage really is. It isn't the absence of fear or the thrill of heroism. It's the quiet decision made in the darkest hour to act, to take one more step forward even when the world says stop. It's a mechanic risking court-martial to save strangers he'll never meet. It's a belief that every limit written by man can be broken by the human spirit. Ted West didn't invent the mosquito, but he gave it its soul. And in doing so, he gave history a lesson far greater than speed or power. He proved that greatness often begins not in laboratories or offices, but in the stubborn hands of ordinary people who refuse to let fear win. So when we look at the old photographs, the mosquito slicing through the clouds, sunlight glinting off its wooden wings, we should remember not just the plane, but the man who made it fly beyond the rules. In every roar of its engines, there's a whisper of his defiance. In every story of its impossible speed, there's a reminder of his faith. The war ended long ago, but courage like his never does. It lives on, in every engineer who dreams, every pilot who believes, and every ordinary soul who dares to make the impossible possible. The world Ted West left behind moved at a speed even he might have struggled to imagine. Jets replaced propellers, computers replaced wrenches, and the language of war turned from the roar of engines to the silent hum of machines. Yet somehow the essence of what he had done, that raw defiance of limitation, that stubborn belief in possibility, lingered like a vibration in the bones of every engineer who came after him. It existed in the way they looked at a blueprint and whispered, "What if?" It lived in the quiet spaces between risk and reason, in that fragile moment where courage begins. Because Ted's story was never about engines or aircraft. It was about the unbreakable will of the human spirit, the idea that one person, with nothing but conviction and a set of tools, could alter the rhythm of history. And long after his name faded from record books, his spirit remained in motion, woven into every turbine that screamed against gravity, every machine that carried humanity one step faster toward the future. In the years that followed his death, aviation entered its golden age. The jet engine, the supersonic boom, the space race, all symbols of mankind's relentless urge to go faster, to reach further. But in every museum where a mosquito stands proudly polished beneath the lights, there is a kind of silence that no jet can fill. It is the silence of wood and sweat, of nights spent in the bitter cold by a man who refused to accept the word impossible. Visitors walk past the display, reading the plaques that speak of innovation and design. But few understand the emotion behind the engineering, the fear, the faith, the loneliness of one mechanic daring to gamble with death. If they listen closely, they might hear it, the faint, rhythmic heartbeat of the Merlin engine, a sound that carries both triumph and pain. The Mosquito was more than a machine. It was a mirror reflecting what humanity becomes when pushed to the edge. Fragile, flawed, yet magnificent. Ted's legacy wasn't the plane itself, it was the philosophy it carried. That limits are often just fears given structure, and that progress requires someone willing to shatter them. When he broke the ministry's rules, he didn't do it for glory or rebellion. He did it because he couldn't bear to stand by while others suffered within the boundaries of bureaucracy. In a world obsessed with safety, he chose courage. In a war ruled by orders, he chose conviction. That was the true essence of his genius, not the mechanical precision of his hands, but the moral precision of his heart. He understood something few ever do, that every great act of creation walks a line between disaster and deliverance, and that every act of bravery begins as an act of faith. Years later, when historians rediscovered his story, they began to see the Mosquito not just as a technological triumph, but as a symbol of human audacity. It wasn't the fastest aircraft because it had to be. It was the fastest because it refused not to be. That spirit, that refusal, became the unspoken foundation of every innovation that followed. The men and women designing the next generation of aircraft, the engineers building spacecraft to pierce the heavens, the dreamers turning blueprints into miracles. All of them, knowingly or not, were carrying forward the same flame Ted once lit in a dim wartime hangar. He had shown that courage is not a lack of fear, but a mastery of it. That even when everything around you says stop, it is sometimes the quiet voice of one person whispering, go, that changes everything. And as the decades rolled into centuries, the Mosquito itself became more than a relic. It became a story, told in documentaries, books, whispered by pilots who still revered its name. It became a symbol of ingenuity born from desperation, a reminder that greatness often comes not from abundance, but from constraint. It was built when Britain was starved of metal, when engineers were told to do the impossible with what little they had, and they did, with wood, glue, and willpower. It was proof that technology serves humanity best when guided by compassion. Ted West had embodied that truth. In every bolt he tightened, every risk he took, every rule he broke, he was fighting not against an enemy, but against resignation, the kind of surrender that kills progress long before any bullet does. Sometimes when the last living pilots of the Mosquito spoke about their missions, they would pause when asked how they survived. Many said the same thing, in their own quiet way. The plane saved us. But what they meant, though they rarely said it aloud, was that someone somewhere had cared enough to make it faster, stronger, better. Someone who believed that survival wasn't a privilege, but a duty. And in that belief lies the heartbeat of every true innovator. The idea that what you create carries the weight of the lives it touches. Ted West may never have called himself a hero, but in his defiance, he became one. Not because he sought victory, but because he refused defeat. Standing at the edge of the 21st century, it's easy to see his story as history. Distant, dusty, complete.